In the quiet stillness of the ancient world, long before writing shaped memory into lines of ink, small gatherings formed around soft circles of firelight. Sparks drifted upward into cool night air. Shadows moved gently across stone and earth, and early humans began to shape their experiences into sound. Tonight's calm story drifts back to those earliest moments when myths were formed from glowing embers, wandering thoughts, and the steady comfort of shared warmth. It follows the origins of storytelling, not as a sudden invention, but as a slow rising of imagination from darkness into flickering light. Long before villages rose from packed earth, and long before symbols settled onto clay tablets, the world was a wide and unsettled place. Across plains and forests, the days stretched in long arcs of silence, broken only by wind brushing through grass or by distant calls of animals moving across the land. As evening settled in, the temperature shifted gently, carrying cool air across early campsites. Firelight flickered along the ground, its glow drawing soft shapes on nearby stone, illuminating small circles where communities gathered after the labor of the day. In this ancient landscape, darkness held a presence deeper than modern eyes can easily imagine. Without walls, lamps, or the comfort of familiar noise, night arrived like a vast curtain, sweeping across valleys and hills in a single quiet movement. The fire offered warmth and safety, but it also created contrast, the bright center of light surrounded by unbroken stretches of shadow. In that space between glow and darkness, imagination began to stir. Figures appeared in the shifting silhouettes cast upon stone, and the rhythm of the flames created a kind of pulse, steady and soothing. The early world moved according to patterns that demanded attention. Migrations of animals, changing skies, mysterious weather, growth and decay, birth and disappearance. For communities living within these rhythms, understanding the world required observation more than explanation. Days were spent following tracks, collecting plants, tending embers, and watching subtle changes in the land. Nights were quieter, more contemplative, shaped by the soft crackle of firewood and the distant sounds of unseen creatures waking in the dark. Within this atmosphere, memory carried great significance. Each event, an unfamiliar sound, a difficult season, a moment of abundance, became a point of reference for survival. As groups gathered near the fire, these memories began to take shape in shared whispers and murmured descriptions. A hunt recounted with gestures, a curious sight retold with widened eyes, a warning expressed through sound rather than words. Over time, these simple exchanges transformed into patterns, gaining rhythm, tone, and a sense of shape. The world felt vast, mysterious, and ever-changing, and people began giving form to its mysteries through the soothing cadence of spoken narrative. In the glow of the fire, time seemed to slow. Sparks drifted upward like wandering stars. Voices softened as shadows deepened, and the night became a canvas for thought. Stories began to rise gently from this setting, first as fragments of memory, then as embellished accounts, and eventually as woven tales that blended reality with imagination. Firelight became the first stage, its warm glow drawing faces closer, encouraging reflection and quiet wonder. And from these earliest gatherings, myth began its long journey through human history, carried forward by voices that spoke softly into the night. In the earliest stretches of human time, long before symbols were carved into bone or clay, daily life unfolded in a steady rhythm shaped by landscape, weather, and the unchanging cycles of the natural world. Communities moved gently across plains and river valleys, following the migrations of animals and the quiet growth of edible plants. Shelters were simple constructions of branches and hides, shaped by necessity rather than design, offering protection from wind and rain, but allowing the sounds of the night to drift easily through. The scent of earth and smoke lingered on the air, settling into hair, skin, and clothing made from softened hide. Each morning began not with sudden urgency, but with the gradual awakening of the land. Birds calling softly from treetops, dew gathering on tall grass, and the crackling of embers stirred back to life from the remnants of the previous night's fire. In this world, survival was an unbroken thread, woven through every hour. Groups traveled across familiar routes where edible roots could be found beneath the soil, or where berries ripened slowly under shifting sunlight. The air carried the scent of crushed leaves, damp bark, and the faint musk of animals passing through earlier in the day. Hands brushed along rough tree trunks, gathered smooth stones from riverbeds, and carried woven baskets filled with whatever the season offered. Each action was careful and deliberate, guided by memory passed from one generation to the next. These shared experiences formed the quiet foundation upon which early storytelling would eventually rise, though its emergence rested still beyond the horizon of thought. As days passed, patterns became clear. Winds shifted with the coming of storms. Birds scattered before changes in weather, and the behavior of animals revealed subtle hints about the landscape. Communities learned these patterns through observation rather than explanation, holding the knowledge collectively rather than assigning it to a single individual. The earth beneath their feet spoke through faint impressions left by hooves or paws. The sky spoke through clouds forming in layered shapes. Each movement, each sound, each texture formed part of an unspoken conversation between people and the land they inhabited. It was through attention to these details that early humans began to interpret the world, setting the stage for the first gentle rise of narrative thought. Evening brought a different rhythm. As the sun drifted behind hills or forests, long shadows stretched across open spaces. The air cooled, carrying the quiet scent of fading warmth and damp soil. Small fires were built using dry branches collected during the day, and their flames rose briefly before settling into a slow, steady burn. These fires formed natural centers for the community, places where the day's movements gave way to stillness. The glow cast soft light onto faces, hands, and the woven texture of clothing. It warmed the air closest to the flames, but left the far edges of the gathering in deep shadow. That boundary between light and dark became a silent participant in the lives of early humans, shaping perception and giving space for imagination to take root. Night held a presence unlike any other time. The sky opened wide, revealing stars scattered in endless patterns above. Their faint glow shimmered through drifting smoke, and the arc of the moon influenced tides, migrations, and internal senses that could not yet be named. The soundscape shifted as nocturnal animals stirred in the dark, their distant movements creating gentle tension, a quiet awareness of the vast, unseen world surrounding the fire's small circle of safety. In this setting, thought stretched beyond the immediate tasks of daily life. Minds wandered, following the movement of flames and the patterns of shadows on stone. Memories surfaced with a clarity shaped by stillness. This nightly pause between labor and rest created the emotional and cognitive space where the first stories began to form. Before storytelling became structured or purposeful, communication relied on sound and gesture. A hunter might mimic the movement of a stag to show the direction it had traveled. A gatherer might recreate the snapping of branches to indicate danger nearby. Children learned through imitation, repeating the movements of adults, copying the calls of birds, and imitating the posture of animals. These early expressions were not stories, but they carried meaning, seeds of narrative that would later grow when memory and imagination converged. With time, these gestures were accompanied by simple vocalizations, rhythmic sounds shaped by breath and instinct. Patterns formed not through planning, but through repetition and recognition. As communities settled around the fire after long days, the recounting of events grew more complex. The memory of a hunt or a surprising moment in the forest did not remain confined to factual description. The glow of the flames encouraged emphasis, hands lingering in the air to show the arc of an animal's leap, voices rising and falling to mimic the tension of a chase, shadows dancing across the ground as the storyteller shifted position. These faint embellishments brought shape to memory, transforming it into something slightly more vivid than the event itself. Over time, these small expansions became expected, welcomed, integrated. A simple recounting became a performance in miniature, gentle and unplanned, but quietly transformative. The earliest stories were not yet myths. They were recollections colored by atmosphere. They reflected awe at natural forces, lightning tearing across the sky, a sudden wind sweeping through tall grass, the deep growl of a predator unseen in the dark. These phenomena prompted questions that had no clear answers. Even without words to articulate curiosity, early humans felt the uneasy blend of fear and wonder that came with observing power beyond their control. Around the fire, these experiences found expression in shared murmurs, gestures, and soft sounds that sought to imitate the forces encountered. Through these shared moments, the foundation of myth began to develop, shaped by a desire to understand the unfamiliar edges of the world. Seasonal cycles added depth to these early narratives. The return of migrating animals, the rhythm of plant growth, the shifting height of the sun across the horizon, all created patterns that encouraged reflection. Stories of previous seasons blended with observations of the present. Knowledge accumulated over years formed the roots of explanations. Why the river swelled in certain months, why certain berries ripened only under specific conditions, why storms gathered from particular directions. Though the explanations were not yet structured or symbolic, they were beginning to resemble the earliest forms of narrative interpretation, bridging the gap between memory and meaning. Later, when communities experienced moments of hardship, scarce food, sudden weather changes, illness, or the loss of a member, the need for comfort found expression through sound, rhythm, and the sharing of memories. Someone might gesture toward the sky and mimic the return of sunlight after a dark season, offering reassurance through symbolism rather than instruction. These early expressions of hope, shaped by emotional need, brought a new dimension to the emerging art of storytelling. The narratives were no longer merely recollections or interpretations. They became tools for emotional connection, easing fear and reinforcing communal bonds during difficult nights. All these developments gathered slowly, like sediment settling in layers at the bottom of a calm lake. Nothing abrupt marked the shift from memory to story, or from story to myth. It happened in small increments shaped by the environment, by daily experiences, and by the rhythm of firelit nights. Within this tapestry of observation, emotion, and shared ritual, the earliest stories continued to expand, preparing the world for the arrival of the first true storytellers. Those who would sense the power of narrative more deeply than others, and who would carry tales from one generation to the next with quiet devotion. As generations passed, the subtle shapes of early storytelling deepened, stretching across time with the same quiet persistence that marked the movement of rivers and the slow shift of seasons. Children born into each new cycle of life grew familiar with the rhythms of evening gatherings, where voices moved gently through the dimness and the crackling of fire provided a steady backdrop. The sounds of nighttime became intertwined with the rise of narrative, distant animal calls, shifting leaves, the soft sigh of embers settling inward. Together, these elements formed an environment in which early stories were not simply spoken. They were experienced as part of the living world. Daily routines shaped the content of these early tales. Hunters returned with memories of distant valleys or of unfamiliar tracks pressed into soft soil. Gatherers shared the discovery of plants rarely seen before, recalling their scents, textures, and how they responded to heat or cold. These accounts, repeated around the fire, gained shape and depth as listeners contributed their own recollections. A sighting of a strange animal in one region might be connected to an unusual call heard by someone else. Over time, isolated observations merged into a broader narrative, forming the earliest examples of collective storytelling. Tales not belonging to a single voice, but to the shared experience of the group. In these moments, the fire acted not merely as a source of warmth, but as a focal point for imagination. Flames rose and fell in gentle patterns, creating shadows that danced along shelter walls or across the ground at the feet of the listeners. These shifting shapes provided visual prompts that encouraged interpretation. A flicker of light might resemble the outline of an antler, prompting a reminder of a previous hunt. A burst of sparks carried upward by a gust might suggest the movement of distant stars. As the story continued, these images layered themselves onto the narrative, adding detail and atmosphere that transcended simple memory. The natural world contributed its own form of narrative. Storms arriving suddenly across open plains introduced dramatic shifts in sound and scent. The first low rumble of thunder rolled across the landscape with deliberate slowness, deepening the sense of anticipation at the fire's edge. Wind swept through tall grasses, bending them in unified motions that resembled the movements of a great unseen creature. Rain tapping softly against leaves created rhythms that echoed the cadence of early speech. These elements carried both meaning and mystery, inviting communities to interpret them not only through practical understanding, but through imaginative association. Each event became part of a broader story that connected land, sky, and living beings. Over time, these associations developed into more structured patterns. Observations made during the day were recalled and expanded during the night. Members of the group who remembered details most vividly began to hold a special presence within the circle. They became recognized for their ability to describe distant events with clarity, weaving sensory impressions into coherent accounts. Their voices carried a subtle cadence shaped by practice and deep attention. Without conscious intention, they began to form the earliest narrative traditions, stories that provided continuity across seasons, linking past experiences to present knowledge. These early stories often served practical purposes. A description of a dangerous animal's behavior might be retold to younger members of the group, ensuring survival. A memory of an abundant harvest season might be repeated during times of scarcity to encourage patience and collective effort. Yet even these practical tales contained elements of wonder. As they passed from mouth to mouth, details softened or expanded, echoing the emotions felt during the original experiences. What began as memory slowly merged with imagination, creating a fluid blend of truth and interpretation that laid the foundation for the earliest myths. As communities grew, interactions with neighboring groups added new layers to storytelling. Visits between groups brought opportunities to share tales of distant landscapes, unfamiliar animals, and unusual weather patterns. These exchanges often took place during seasonal gatherings, where fires burned throughout the night and conversations drifted across open spaces under star-filled skies. Listeners from one group heard stories shaped by environments very different from their own. Descriptions of towering mountains or dense forests created images in the mind that broadened understanding of the wider world. In turn, these stories were carried home and retold, gradually merging with existing narratives to create new variations. In addition to expanding geographic awareness, these exchanges contributed to a growing sense of shared symbolism. Certain animals gained significance across regions, not because of coordinated belief, but because their behaviors evoked similar feelings in distant communities. The migration of birds suggested long journeys or the changing of seasons. The howl of a wolf at night evoked a sense of both danger and connection. The rising sun, steady and dependable, became a symbol of renewal and hope. Over generations, these symbols became embedded in stories, adding structure and thematic depth to narratives that had once been simple recollections. With the passage of time, storytelling found its role in shaping social cohesion. During moments of uncertainty, such as sudden illness, shifts in weather, or the disappearance of a familiar food source, the community gathered more tightly around the fire, listening to voices that carried the wisdom of past experiences. These stories brought comfort, reminding listeners that challenges had been faced before and that solutions had been found through patience and unity. The narratives offered reassurance through continuity, connecting present difficulty with the memory of resilience. As storytelling deepened, the gestures accompanying it grew more expressive. Hands shaped the trajectory of a running animal, traced the arc of the sun across the sky, or mimicked the movement of waves in a river swollen after rainfall. These visual elements engaged listeners more fully, drawing them into the unfolding narrative. Over time, these gestures became conventional forms, shared movements that communicated meaning even without words. They marked a step in the evolution of communication, hinting at the future development of symbolic languages that would eventually shape writing. The evolution of storytelling did not follow a single path. Some communities developed narratives that focused on the natural world, explaining the behavior of animals or the patterns of weather. Others created stories that revolved around ancestors, attributing great deeds or mysterious events to those who had walked the land before them. Still others imagined beings that existed beyond the realm of human experience, creatures of shadow or light, spirits of wind or water. These variations reflected the diversity of landscapes and lived experiences, yet all were connected by the common need to make sense of the world's mysteries. As these narratives intertwined with daily life, they influenced behavior. Certain rituals emerged, shaped by stories that emphasized respect for particular animals or features of the landscape. Children learned these tales early, absorbing their symbolic lessons long before fully understanding them. Storytelling sessions often coincided with key moments before a hunt, during the first appearance of a new season, or following important communal events such as births or losses. In these settings, stories provided a sense of order and meaning, reinforcing the social bonds that held the group together. The growth of storytelling mirrored the gradual shaping of human consciousness. It reflected the ability to recall events, imagine possibilities, and assign meaning to patterns observed in the environment. It also revealed the earliest forms of creative expression, voices adjusting tone to evoke emotion, hands forming shapes to illustrate movement, minds weaving together memory and imagination. Through these practices, storytelling became one of the earliest cultural tools, shaping identity and providing continuity across generations. In the gentle quiet that followed each nightly gathering, the embers of the fire glowed like fading stars, their soft light illuminating the spaces where stories had just been shared. As sleep approached, minds drifted through the images formed during the evening, animals running through tall grass, storms forming over distant hills, ancestors walking along familiar paths. These images blended with dreams, creating a seamless transition between waking and sleeping thought. The next day, fragments of these dreams sometimes reappeared in conversation, adding depth to the next tale told around the fire. Through countless cycles of day and night, of warmth and cold, of abundance and scarcity, storytelling continued to grow, fed by memory, emotion, environment, and imagination. And within these evolving narratives emerged figures who would become the first true storytellers, keepers of tales, preservers of wisdom, shapers of meaning. Their presence signaled a shift from communal retelling to intentional creation, marking the beginning of a deeper, more structured form of myth that would carry forward through generations. As the long rhythms of early storytelling settled into the quiet spaces of nightly life, the gatherings around the fire began to change in subtle ways. What had once been shared memory passed gently from one voice to another, slowly took on new shape. Some individuals listened with an attention deeper than the rest, their eyes lingering on the flames, their thoughts following patterns unseen by others. These individuals observed not only events, but the reactions stirred within the group. They noticed when certain details brought comfort, when others stirred curiosity, and when silence invited reflection. Over time, their voices began to weave the fragments of shared experience into something more deliberate and more resonant. Communities came to recognize these voices, not through ceremony or title, but through the quiet authority carried in their recollections. Their stories reached beyond immediate memory, touching on older moments, ancestral events, and interpretations shaped by intuition. They held the group's history gently within them, preserving what others forgot and expanding what others only hinted at. As seasons turned and nights grew long, these figures became steady presences near the fire, their silhouettes outlined softly against the glow. And in the growing circle of listeners, a shift unfolded. The stories no longer existed only as echoes of the day. They began to carry meaning shaped by those who told them. A new role emerged, not defined by any single gesture, but by the subtle accumulation of trust, insight, and memory. It is here, in this deepening of voice and vision, that the narrative turns toward one such figure, an early storyteller whose quiet presence helped shape the first threads of myth. Among the early communities who gathered at the edges of firelight, one figure stood quietly at the center of many nights. This individual did not rise through strength or authority, nor through any formal role the group could name. Instead, a presence formed naturally around this figure, shaped by years of memory, observation, and the steady rhythm of watching the world with unusual attention. The earliest generations remembered this person not as a leader, but as someone who carried knowledge with a gentle, steady patience. Knowledge that would someday soften into the first recognizable myths. From childhood, this early storyteller displayed a particular sensitivity to the movements of the world around them. In the cool mornings when dew clung to tall grass, their eyes followed the faint tracks left by animals passing through hours earlier. While others focused on gathering roots or scanning the horizon for movement, this individual often paused to observe the small details others overlooked. A broken twig, the texture of disturbed soil, the pattern of insects gathering where fruit had fallen. These signs told stories long before they took shape in words, stories of what had moved through the land, what had eaten, what had fled, and what lingered unseen in the quiet spaces between daylight and darkness. As the figure grew older, these observations formed a foundation of knowledge that extended beyond practical survival. They became attuned to the subtle shifts in the sky, noting the position of stars as they changed with the seasons, watching the arc of the moon rise and fall through distant treetops. Winds carried meaning too, their direction, their scent, their warmth or coolness hinting at weather patterns that could not yet be predicted by language. This accumulation of insight created a mind shaped by continuity and connection, able to weave observations into patterns that others sensed but could not articulate. During the day, the figure moved among the rest of the group, participating in the rhythm of collective life. Hunts were joined, plants gathered, shelters tended, tools shaped from bone and stone. Nothing distinguished them from the others in these tasks, yet a quiet focus marked their movements. When storms formed in the distance, the storyteller often paused to watch the clouds gather. When animals behaved strangely, they lingered, observing with a gaze sharpened by months of practice. Over time, these observations grew into an internal landscape of meaning, a silent awareness of cause and effect that reached beyond the immediate world. The first hint of this person's emerging role appeared in the simplest of moments. After a long day, when the fire crackled beneath the growing weight of night, the group often sat together in a semicircle, leaning close to the warmth. Conversations drifted slowly, shaped by fatigue and the comfort of predictable routine. In these moments, the storyteller occasionally spoke, softly at first, offering a recollection of something seen during the day. a strange movement in the grass, the way birds had flown in unusual formation, a memory of a similar event from years earlier. These small contributions did not immediately create myth, but they began to invite reflection. Listeners noticed that these recollections carried a certain clarity, richer in detail than others. Where someone else might describe an animal simply as large or swift, the storyteller described the sheen of its fur under light, its posture as it paused to listen, the subtle tension in its movements that hinted at its mood. These details created images within the minds of listeners, images that lingered long after the sound faded. Without intention, the storyteller became a keeper of memory, someone who held events with careful attention and could reassemble them with gentle precision. Seasons passed, and with each cycle, the figure's voice gained confidence. Not louder, but steadier, shaping stories with a calm cadence that matched the rhythm of fire. Listeners leaned closer, drawn by the subtle tide of meaning beneath each retelling. The storyteller began linking events across time, referencing patterns from years past, comparing the movement of the sky to the behavior of animals, connecting the mood of the land with the outcome of the hunt. These links formed the earliest strands of narrative, weaving disparate moments into coherent sequences. During periods of hardship, harsh winters, scarce food, sudden illness, the storyteller's presence took on greater significance. On nights when uncertainty settled over the group, the figure spoke of earlier difficulties and how the community had endured. Their voice carried the memory of resilience, offering reassurance through continuity. These stories calmed restless minds, softening fear with the reminder that the group had faced adversity before and survived. In these moments, narrative became more than recollection. It became a form of emotional shelter, easing the weight of the unknown. The storyteller's influence grew in quiet increments. During the long nights of winter, when the world beyond the fire became an expanse of cold darkness, the figure shaped tales that connected the group with the distant past. They spoke of ancestors whose tracks had faded into the land, but whose actions lived on in memory. They described events long before the youngest members were born, carrying stories passed down from elders who had since returned to the earth. In this way, the storyteller preserved the lineage of experience, creating a bridge between generations that extended far beyond individual lifespans. Over time, the stories began drifting into territory that blended memory with imagination. A storm might be described not merely as wind and rain, but as the movement of a great unseen presence traveling across the sky. A hunt might be shaped into a tale where animals acted with intention beyond instinct, guided by forces that the storyteller sensed but could not fully describe. These elements did not distort reality. Rather, they enriched it, creating space for wonder. Listeners found comfort in narratives that suggested meaning hidden within the patterns of the world, meaning that made the unpredictable feel familiar and the dangerous feel interconnected with a larger cycle. The figure's role became especially prominent during rituals marking the passage of seasons. When the first thaw of spring softened the ground, or when the final leaves of autumn fell to the wind, the storyteller recalled similar transitions from years before. They described how the land responded, how animals prepared for what was coming, how the sky shifted in color and brightness. These stories helped the community understand its place within a landscape that changed with steady inevitability. The storyteller's voice became a guide through these transitions, offering a sense of grounding amid the world's ceaseless motion. As the years advanced, the storyteller's influence extended beyond the immediate group. Visitors from neighboring communities, drawn by trade, kinship, or migration, sometimes joined the nightly gatherings. When they returned to their own groups, they carried fragments of the stories with them. These fragments merged with local memories and beliefs, slowly altering as they passed from voice to voice. Through this exchange, the storyteller's narratives began traveling far beyond their original circle of listeners, contributing to a growing web of interwoven tales across distant regions. The figure who shaped these stories aged with quiet dignity. Lines formed slowly on the face, shoulders curved gently with time, and hair carried the pale traces of many seasons. Yet the voice remained steady, carrying the same calm cadence that had brought comfort in earlier years. Younger members of the group watched the storyteller with admiration, sensing the depth of memory held within that gentle presence. Some began emulating the rhythm of the voice, practicing gestures, or observing the world with renewed care. The seeds of future storytellers took root in these moments, nurtured by example rather than instruction. In the final stretch of life, the storyteller continued to speak, though with fewer words and longer silences. The pauses held weight, allowing listeners to imagine details unspoken, inviting them to contribute their own reflections. In these quiet moments, storytelling became a shared act, a collective weaving of memory, observation, and imagination. And when the storyteller's voice eventually faded from the gatherings, the stories remained, carried forward by those who had listened through countless nights. These tales, shaped across a lifetime, would continue evolving long after the original voice fell silent, transforming gradually into the myths that would guide communities through seasons and generations to come. After the storyteller's voice faded from the gatherings, the memory of that presence lingered like the last warmth of embers resting beneath a layer of soft ash. Those who had listened through many seasons felt the absence gently, not as a sudden break, but as a quiet shift in the rhythm of nightly life. The fire still crackled, casting familiar shapes across the ground, but the stories that once drifted easily through the air seemed to rest in stillness for a time, waiting for the next voice to lift them once more into motion. In that pause, the community held space for remembrance, honoring the figure through silence as much as through words. Yet the stories did not remain dormant for long. One evening, as dusk settled over the landscape and the scent of cooling earth rose softly through the air, a younger member of the group began to speak. The voice wavered at first, carrying the uncertainty of someone stepping into a new role. But the cadence, though faint, held an echo of the elder's rhythm, a rhythm shaped by seasons of careful listening. The younger storyteller did not attempt to recreate the elder's tales word for word. Instead, they spoke of recent events, the behavior of animals at the riverbank, the shifting pattern of clouds, the memory of a trail followed earlier that day. These simple recollections subtly carried forward the tradition of observation and reflection inherited from the elder who had shaped so many nights. As the younger storyteller continued, confidence grew in gentle increments. The voice settled into a steady tone, rising and falling with a natural rhythm shaped by experience rather than imitation. Listeners leaned closer, drawn not only to the content of the story, but to the emergence of a new presence within the circle. In these moments, storytelling proved itself to be more than the work of a single figure. It was a continuity made possible through the quiet willingness of new voices to rise, supported by the lingering memory of those who had come before. This transition reflected a deeper truth about the early world. Knowledge and tradition were carried not by individuals alone, but by the community as a whole. The stories could not remain silent, for they held the collected wisdom of many generations. They contained patterns of seasons, descriptions of landscape, memories of change, and interpretations of forces that shaped the group's survival. Without them, the community would lose not only guidance, but the sense of connection that drew members together during long nights. And so, the stories continued, evolving with each new voice that joined the circle. As years passed, the young storyteller matured, becoming a figure recognized for a unique ability to weave together moments from daily life. This figure noticed how storms moved across the land with the same quiet deliberation as herds of animals. They saw how the phases of the moon influenced tides and behaved differently during specific seasons. They sensed how the first frost of winter carried a silence that differed from the deep quiet of midsummer nights. Each observation added another thread to the intricate tapestry of stories that grew steadily through the seasons. During this period, the storyteller began shaping narratives that reached beyond simple recollection. One tale described the movement of the stars across the sky, linking their path to the journey of ancient ancestors who walked long distances during a time when the world felt wider and more uncertain. Another tale imagined the wind as a guide, carrying messages from distant lands, explaining the shifts in weather through gentle metaphor. These stories, though rooted in memory and experience, carried a subtle layer of imagination that hinted at forces unseen, shaping a deeper understanding of the world. The storyteller's growing influence expanded the role of narrative within the community. Stories no longer reflected only what had happened, but offered interpretations of why events occurred. When the rains arrived late, narratives reminded listeners of past seasons when the land had endured similar delays. When the hunt proved difficult, stories explained that animals sometimes moved unpredictably, following instincts shaped by the landscape itself. These explanations reassured the community, offering meaning during uncertain moments and encouraging patience. As time flowed onward, the storyteller gained recognition beyond their immediate group. Visitors from neighboring communities, intrigued by the stories told during seasonal gatherings, began to return with deliberate intention, eager to listen to the voice that carried such depth. The stories traveled with them as they departed, retold, reshaped, and infused with the perspectives of new listeners. In this way, a single storyteller influenced a network of narrative traditions that extended far beyond the boundaries of one community's world. Over time, certain tales became shared across multiple regions, their details shifting with each retelling. A story describing a great river spirit might take on new qualities depending on the landscape where it was retold. In forested regions, the spirit's voice might be said to resemble the rustling of leaves. In open plains, it might echo the howl of wind sweeping across tall grass. These flexible variations allowed stories to remain relevant as they traveled, adapting to the lived experiences of each group that embraced them. Through this process, narrative became a thread that connected disparate communities through shared mythic themes. The storyteller continued shaping stories well into later life, though age gradually changed the pace of their voice. Where once the words flowed quickly and easily, they now emerged with a slower cadence that invited even deeper reflection. Long pauses filled the spaces between phrases, allowing listeners to absorb images and meanings before the next segment unfolded. These pauses created a rhythm that mirrored the quiet progression of time itself, a rhythm that encouraged listeners to explore the spaces between the storyteller's words. In these later years, the storyteller became a mentor to a new generation of listeners who watched the craft with careful attention. Children gathered closest to the fire, studying the storyteller's gestures, the slight changes in tone, the way stories began with simple observations before expanding into broader narrative arcs. These children, still uncertain of their own roles, imitated aspects of the storyteller's performance during daytime play. They repeated fragments of tales, added their own embellishments, and shaped small stories for each other as they explored the landscape. These early attempts reflected the beginning of their journey toward becoming storytellers themselves. As the storyteller's strength waned, the community recognized the shift with quiet acceptance. There were nights when the figure remained silent, listening to the stories told by younger members of the group. The role they had carried for so long began passing gradually to those who had absorbed their teachings through years of attentive listening. The transition unfolded without ceremony or announcement, shaped instead by the natural progression of life and memory. When the storyteller finally took their last breath beneath a peaceful sky, the stories continued without interruption. No tale was lost, for each one had been shared, shaped, and absorbed by the community. The voice that once carried them had faded, but the stories themselves remained alive within the memories of those who had listened. They were retold in new voices, voices that carried the subtle influence of the elders' cadence, gestures, and understanding of the world. And so, the legacy of the first storytellers endured not through monuments or written records, but through the living tradition of voice. The stories rippled outward through time, shaping myths that would take form in countless generations, evolving with the needs and imaginations of the people who carried them. These tales, born beside the earliest fires, would someday echo in the grand myths of distant civilizations, stories of creation, heroes, spirits, and the origins of the world. The life of this early storyteller faded into the vastness of prehistory, but their influence remained as enduring as the patterns of stars that had accompanied so many nights of listening. Their quiet presence continued through every retold tale, every shared symbol, and every voice that rose to fill the silence after dusk. And from this lineage of voices, myth began its long ascent into the heart of human culture, preparing the way for the mysteries and symbolic worlds that lay far ahead. As the final echoes of the storyteller's life drifted gently into memory, the tales that had once risen from a single voice continued to move quietly through the community, like soft wind traveling across open plains. Nights around the fire settled into a familiar rhythm once more, shaped now by many voices rather than one, each carrying a fragment of what had been learned. Stories layered upon one another, weaving old recollections with new interpretation, their meanings shifting slightly as different hands and minds shaped their contours. Over time, these tales became threads too old to trace to any single source, settling into the deeper fabric of tradition where ancestry and imagination merged. Generations passed, and the world surrounding these communities continued its slow transformation. People migrated along rivers, crossed valleys, and explored new regions shaped by rock, forest, and changing skies. As they moved, the stories moved with them, carried in memory and repeated during moments of rest. New landscapes invited new details, guiding the evolution of each tale that survived the journey. Slowly, stories that had once belonged to small clusters of families spread across wide distances, becoming more than personal recollections. They became cultural inheritance. In time, these inherited stories left traces not only in memory, but in the materials of daily life. Shapes carved into bone, figures painted on stone walls, patterns etched into tools and ornaments hinted at meanings older than the objects themselves. Though countless voices had shaped the tales, their echoes remained embedded in these markings, preserved in places where time worked gently rather than erasing quickly. And it is here, in those traces left in earth, stone, and pigment, that the narrative drifts toward the deeper mysteries carried by the first storytellers. Mysteries still studied in fragments uncovered by patient hands thousands of years later. Across the distant millennia, long after the earliest storytellers walked along riverbanks and rested near low-burning fires, time settled quietly over the landscapes they once knew. Seasons shifted in their familiar cycles. Rain softened hardened soil. Rivers changed their courses, grain by grain, and wind carried dust across plains, where old campsites gradually faded into the earth. What humans had left behind became layered beneath generations of sediment and growth, preserved not intentionally, but through the gentle indifference of the natural world. And within these layers, faint traces of the earliest stories remained, waiting for distant descendants to rediscover them. The first hints appeared not as words or symbols arranged deliberately, but as shapes carved into the walls of caves and stone shelters. These images captured moments of life with remarkable clarity: herds of animals in mid-stride, hunters poised with raised arms, patterns of dots and lines whose meaning had long since slipped beyond the reach of modern understanding. In the flicker of torchlight within ancient caverns, these figures seemed to stir faintly, as if carrying the echoes of the narratives once spoken in their presence. The colors, drawn from minerals ground into powder and mixed with natural binders, retained a subdued glow that resisted the erosion of time. They offered glimpses into worlds where storytelling and art were inseparable, each reinforcing the other through ritual, memory, and shared meaning. Some of the oldest markings depicted animals with extraordinary detail: the curve of a mammoth's tusk, the pattern of spots on a great cat, the layered movement of a running herd, all suggested deep familiarity with the behaviors and forms of the creatures that roamed the prehistoric world. For the communities who created these images, the animals were more than subjects of observation. They were central figures in the stories passed down across generations. The careful attention given to each line revealed a connection rooted in both respect and necessity. These animals shaped daily survival, but they also shaped imagination, inspiring tales that blended memory with meaning. The carvings and paintings became silent companions to the stories spoken beside firelight. Beyond animal forms, some caves held abstract patterns whose purposes remained hidden behind the passage of thousands of years. Spirals, intersecting lines, clusters of dots, and repeated handprints suggested an early attempt to represent ideas not easily expressed through naturalistic imagery. These symbols may have marked rituals, mapped seasonal migrations, or conveyed spiritual concepts lost to time. Archaeologists examining these shapes approach them with careful thought, aware that their interpretations could only approximate the meanings felt by those who first created them. Yet even without full understanding, the patterns conveyed a sense of intention, evidence that early humans sought ways to record narrative structures in forms that transcended spoken words. Among the most evocative traces were hand stencils formed by placing a hand against stone and blowing pigment around it, leaving a clear outline. These stencils appeared in clusters, sometimes layered over older ones, suggesting moments when community members added their presence to a shared space. Each handprint stood as a silent declaration of existence, a mark of identity that reached across time. Some were small, belonging to children who once listened to stories with wide, curious eyes. Others were large, perhaps belonging to elders whose voices shaped the myths carried across generations. These prints formed an early collection of signatures, remnants of a culture that used both image and voice to connect past with present. Archaeological discoveries extended beyond cave walls. In areas where early communities gathered for long periods, remnants of fire pits revealed blackened layers of charcoal preserved beneath sediment. Stone tools scattered around the periphery bore signs of repeated use, while fragments of bone suggested the presence of shared meals. These physical remains marked spaces where nighttime gatherings had unfolded, where stories had traveled from voice to voice under the shifting glow of flames. Though the words themselves had vanished, the arrangement of these hearths, often in circles, hinted at the communal structure of early storytelling, where the fire served as the center from which narrative radiated outward. Some sites revealed traces of early musical instruments, crafted from hollow bones pierced with carefully spaced holes. These flutes produced tones that resonated gently through open spaces when played, their sound shaped by the breath of individuals who once used them to accompany stories or rituals. The presence of these instruments suggested that early storytelling did not rely solely on spoken words or gestures. Rhythm, sound, and melody contributed to the emotional landscape of the tale, enhancing its atmosphere and allowing listeners to feel the story's progression as much as hear it. In quiet caves, where echoes carried the notes across stone walls, these instruments would have created an immersive experience that deepened connection and narrative immersion. Other artifacts offered glimpses into symbolic traditions. Carved figurines of humans and animals, smoothed by years of handling, were found buried with their owners or placed carefully within ritual spaces. The figurines varied widely in form and style, some abstract and simplified, others richly detailed. Their purposes ranged from totems of protection to objects used in teaching or ritual storytelling. These pieces served as tangible embodiments of narratives that no longer survived in sound, allowing archaeologists to imagine the stories once woven around them. The figurines acted as fragments of myth, carried across time through the stubborn resilience of stone, ivory, or bone. Even the arrangement of ancient living spaces contributed to understanding early storytelling. Some settlements featured central gathering areas surrounded by shelters, indicating a place where groups assembled regularly. Fireplaces found in these communal spaces often bore signs of long-term use. Layers of ash from countless nights, charred stones cracked by repeated heating and cooling, and surrounding debris shaped by human activity. These remnants spoke of evenings filled with murmured discussions, quiet songs, and the gentle rhythm of stories unfolding in the flicker of firelight. The physical evidence reinforced the understanding that storytelling was not an occasional diversion, but a central aspect of early communal life. In some regions, rock formations and standing stones suggested intentional placement, aligned with celestial events. Solstices and equinoxes appeared to play roles in early narratives, linking the movement of the sky with cycles of life on Earth. Stories connected to these alignments may have explained changes in seasons or carried symbolic meanings tied to growth, abundance, and renewal. Although the full significance of these structures remained elusive, their existence hinted at the early merging of myth, observation, and ritual, key elements in the development of more complex storytelling traditions. Through these discoveries, archaeologists attempted to reconstruct the atmosphere of prehistoric storytelling. They imagined fires burning in the dim recesses of caves, shadows dancing along walls adorned with painted images, and voices echoing softly through stone passages. They envisioned the careful preparation of pigments, the carving of figurines, and the rhythmic playing of bone flutes, all contributing to immersive gatherings that blended sound, image, and movement. These scenes, though reconstructed through fragments, carried an undeniable sense of continuity, an understanding that the desire to tell stories arose not from convenience, but from the deep human need to interpret the world. Though the precise words of early tales remained lost, their essence survived in the emotional weight carried by these ancient traces. The images hinted at wonder, reverence, fear, admiration, and curiosity, feeling that shaped the earliest myths and fueled their retelling across generations. Each artifact, each mark on stone, each arranged hearth served as a quiet whisper from the ancestors, offering glimpses of a world where storytelling formed the bridge between experience and meaning. Across distant landscapes, further clues emerged in places where erosion slowly exposed layers of ancient earth. In riverbeds where water carved deep channels through rock and sediment, fragments of ochre-stained stone and charcoal revealed moments when early humans gathered to mark surfaces or prepare pigments. These finds hinted at the communal nature of storytelling rituals, moments when groups combined their efforts to create symbols that outlasted the gatherings themselves. The presence of pigment grinders, stained tools, and small hollowed stones used for mixing indicated the level of care invested in such creations. These objects were not discarded casually. They were shaped for repeated use, becoming instruments in the long tradition of memory making. Further north, remnants of carved antlers displayed intricate, repeating patterns that archaeologists struggled to interpret. Some marked the passage of seasons, their lines mirroring the length of daylight or the migration of animals. Others seemed purely decorative, suggesting an aesthetic sensibility intertwined with symbolic meaning. Carvings found on antler handles or ritual objects indicated that stories often spilled beyond the spoken realm, entering the tangible world through careful craftsmanship. With each stroke of a sharpened stone, early humans recorded impressions, emotions, and beliefs, embedding their myths within the materials that shaped their daily lives. Excavations in ancient burial sites revealed still deeper layers of narrative tradition. Among the resting places of early humans, archaeologists uncovered figurines arranged with deliberate care. Beads shaped from shells carried inland from distant coasts, and tools crafted with precision. These objects were placed beside the deceased not merely as possessions, but as symbols of the stories, roles, and relationships that had defined their lives. Their presence in graves suggested that myth and memory extended beyond the realm of the living, offering continuity into whatever unknown existed beyond death. The careful placement of these items showed that early societies engaged with questions of meaning, transition, and continuity, questions that storytelling helped explore. In some regions, burial mounds and stone circles marked the presence of ritual landscapes shaped by narrative imagination. These structures often aligned with celestial events, capturing the moments when the sun hovered at the horizon or when the full moon cast its brightest light. Their construction required communal effort, cooperation, and shared intention. The gatherings that accompanied their creation likely involved storytelling, explanations of why stones needed to align in certain patterns, why mounds should face particular directions, and what meanings these structures carried across generations. Though modern observers could only speculate, the careful alignment of stone and earth suggested that myth and cosmology formed a significant part of the early symbolic world. The discovery of ancient footprints preserved in mud and later dried into hardened layers of earth offered rare glimpses into the everyday context of storytelling. Some tracks showed adults walking alongside children, their strides matching in a rhythm, suggesting protection and guidance. Others revealed moments of sudden movement, a chase, a search, or an exploration. These footprints captured the physical presence of communities whose stories once filled the night, providing a reminder that the mythical worlds preserved in art and artifact were rooted in the lives of real people navigating landscapes shaped by challenge and opportunity. Each footprint contributed to a larger narrative, hinting at the worlds that existed alongside the earliest myths. In later millennia, as human societies developed more complex social structures, storytelling grew increasingly intertwined with ritual spaces. Archaeological evidence from early urban settlements revealed courtyards, open plazas, and meeting areas where communities gathered during specific times of the year. These spaces often contained altars, decorated stones and carved posts bearing symbols passed down through generations. The placement of these objects suggested that certain tales gained prominence during seasonal ceremonies, shaping communal identity through shared experience. Stories may have explained the cycles of planting and harvest, the movement of stars, or the origin of particular customs, reinforcing the roles that narrative played in establishing social cohesion. Excavations in once inhabited caves uncovered layers of soot on ceilings, indicating extended periods of occupation and ritual use. The density of soot suggested that fires had been lit repeatedly over hundreds or even thousands of years, providing warmth and illumination during storytelling gatherings. The acoustics of some caves amplified sound in unique ways, creating echoes that transform spoken words into layered rhythms. These natural amplifications likely reinforced the mystical atmosphere of rituals, enhancing the emotional resonance of stories as they moved through the enclosed spaces. Archaeologists imagined how voices once reverberated softly through the chambers, carrying tales of ancestors, animals, and unseen forces that shaped life beyond the cave walls. Elsewhere, hearth sites preserved beneath collapsed shelters revealed patterns of arrangement that seemed to reflect social organization. In some settlements, hearths were positioned centrally, allowing members of the community to sit in a circle while sharing stories. In others, multiple hearths positioned along longhouse interiors suggested smaller clusters of families gathering for more intimate storytelling sessions. These spatial arrangements indicated that narrative traditions were adaptable, shaping themselves to the needs and preferences of each community. Some nights may have been filled with large gatherings, while others unfolded in quieter circles where families shared stories tailored to their own memories and aspirations. One of the most intriguing archaeological clues came from etched bones bearing repeating motifs. These motifs included zigzag lines, curved arcs, and cross-hatched patterns. Some researchers speculated that these markings represented early attempts to record stories symbolically, capturing details that could be recited or interpreted during rituals. Others believed the markings served as mnemonic devices, visual prompts that guided storytellers through sequences of events or symbolic meanings. Whatever their intended purpose, these etched bones revealed a growing desire to preserve stories more reliably, bridging the gap between fleeting spoken words and enduring physical memory. Across all these discoveries, a common theme emerged. Early storytelling was not merely entertainment, but a vital part of human identity. It shaped rituals, guided daily survival, and created a sense of continuity across generations. It connected communities to their landscapes, their ancestors, and their values. Though the exact stories remained beyond reach, the artifacts they left behind carried the weight of countless nights spent around fires, of hands shaping symbols into stone, of voices rising gently into the quiet interior of caves, or across open plains beneath starlit skies. As archaeologists pieced together these fragments, a picture formed of a world where myth and daily life existed in seamless harmony. The boundaries between practical observation and imaginative interpretation blurred, creating narratives that helped early humans understand not only the land around them, but their own place within it. These stories, shaped by memory and ritual, became the foundation upon which later civilizations would build complex mythological traditions. And through these discoveries, a quiet realization emerged. Though thousands of years had passed, the impulse that gave rise to the first stories remained unchanged. The desire to interpret, to imagine, to connect, and to preserve meaning continued to shape human expression. In the smooth contours of carved figurines, in the lingering pigments on cave walls, and in the faint marks etched into bone, the earliest storytellers left behind a silent legacy that stretched forward through time, preparing the way for the elaborate mythologies that would soon rise from the same ancient impulse. As more layers of the ancient world revealed themselves through pigments, carvings, and the quiet geometry of long-buried tools, a broader picture of early storytelling began to take shape. The traces left behind did not speak in clear sentences or familiar symbols, yet they carried the unmistakable presence of minds seeking meaning within the vastness of their surroundings. These marks, footprints, hearths, and figurines formed a map of human imagination, stretching across continents and generations. Through them, it became possible to sense not only what early humans saw, but how they interpreted what they saw, how their inner worlds responded to the rhythms of land, sky, and time. But stories were never shaped solely by the everyday actions of hunters, gatherers, and small family groups. Across the ancient world, some individuals lived in roles defined by responsibility, tradition, and social significance. Their lives unfolded in spaces where ritual carried weight, where symbolic knowledge accumulated, and where narrative served purposes far beyond simple recollection. These individuals, keepers of memory, interpreters of signs, and guardians of communal identity, stood at the center of early societies, their presence shaping the way stories were told, preserved, and transformed. As the narrative drifts forward, it turns toward these figures and the worlds they inhabited. Quieter, more structured spaces, where early forms of leadership and ritual authority gave rise to the first storytellers of status, whose roles extended beyond the firelit circles into the deeper structures of culture. In the quieter regions of the ancient world, where early communities settled for longer periods and began shaping the rhythms of life around predictable cycles, certain individuals emerged whose roles differed subtly from those who hunted, gathered, or crafted tools. These figures lived within the same landscapes, walked the same forest paths, and shared the same food, yet their responsibilities extended into realms of meaning, memory, and ritual. They were not chiefs in the political sense known in later societies, nor were they rulers with authority defined by territory or wealth. Instead, they served as keepers of continuity, those who carried the stories of the group with deliberate intention, ensuring that knowledge, belief, and identity remained woven through each passing generation. Their lives unfolded in spaces slightly removed from the constant motion of daily survival, while others prepared for hunts, tended fires, or crafted tools from stone and bone. These figures spent long stretches of time observing the world with a steady and contemplative gaze. They watched the movement of light across the landscape, noticing how shadows lengthened differently in each season. They traced the migration patterns of animals, reflecting not only on where herds moved, but on what those movements suggested about the deeper rhythms of the land. Their days were filled with small details, subtle shifts in temperature, the first call of certain birds at dawn, the way clouds gathered in layered formations before rain, In these observations, they found the foundations of stories that gave shape to communal understanding. Their shelters were often situated near communal spaces, positioned so they could easily participate in gatherings while still maintaining a quiet place for reflection. Inside these shelters, objects accumulated that reflected their roles. Carved stones bearing symbols known only to them, pigments used in rituals or teaching, animal bones arranged in ways that suggested patterns or cycles, and small stringed bundles of plants or minerals believed to hold meaning. These objects were not valued for their practical use, but for the way they anchored stories, physical reminders of events, rituals, or beliefs that had been carried through generations. In many early societies, these keepers of story played central roles during major communal events. Seasonal transitions were among the most significant. As winter loosened its grip and the land softened with the first warmth of spring, they marked the shift with ceremonies that acknowledged renewal, growth, and the return of abundance. During these gatherings, their voices carried the stories of previous years, stories that reminded the community of cycles older than individual memory. They spoke of past winters, harsher than the one just ended, of springs that brought unexpected bounty, and of ancestors whose presence lingered in the landscape. Their narratives offered reassurance through continuity, helping the group remember that each season formed part of a larger pattern. Similarly, the arrival of autumn called for different rituals that acknowledged the beginning of descent toward darkness and cold. The keepers of story recounted tales associated with this period, the migration of animals, the gathering of crucial food stores, and the behaviors of ancestors who once walked the same paths. These stories blended memory and meaning, shaping the emotional landscape of the community as it prepared for the challenges of winter. Although such stories served practical purposes, they also carried symbolic weight, suggesting that the world's rhythms were guided by forces beyond immediate observation. In some communities, ritual spaces developed around these storytelling traditions. Stones were arranged in circles or lines, forming places where gatherings could unfold in deliberate order. These spaces might contain elevated areas where the keepers of story sat or stood, though their roles were not marked by hierarchy so much as by the recognition of responsibility. Some adorned themselves with symbols crafted from bone, shell, or pigment, markers that indicated a connection to ancestral knowledge. These adornments were not signs of power, but of continuity, reminders that they held traditions older than their own lifetimes. The stories shared by these figures often extended beyond practical knowledge into realms touched by wonder and reverence. They spoke of forces that shaped the world, winds that whispered messages long before storms arrived, rivers that remembered the footsteps of ancestors, and stars that tracked the passage of time. These descriptions did not aim to explain the world scientifically. Rather, they offered a sense of connection between human communities and the vastness surrounding them. Through these narratives, early humans found comfort in believing that the world had intention, pattern, and meaning. The keepers of story also acted as guardians of memory during moments of transition in the life of the community. When a member of the group passed into death, they led gatherings that honored the individual's journey. Their voices recounted the person's deeds, relationships, and experiences, weaving them into the larger narrative of the group. Objects associated with the deceased were placed alongside them, chosen for their symbolic significance. These rituals ensured that individual lives became part of the collective story, preventing memories from fading into silence. Over time, these practices contributed to early forms of ancestor veneration, a tradition in which voices of the living remained connected to those who had come before. Their influence extended into periods of uncertainty as well. When harsh weather arrived unexpectedly, when animals changed their patterns without clear cause, or when illness moved quietly through the community, the keepers of story offered a steady presence. They reminded the group of past events with similar challenges, noting how earlier generations had endured and regained stability. Their stories, shaped by centuries of inherited knowledge, framed difficulties not as isolated crises, but as part of a larger cycle in which life flowed with alternating moments of hardship and abundance. This sense of continuity helped ease fear, allowing communities to confront the unknown with calm acceptance. Despite their importance, the keepers of story did not live apart from the rest of the community. They participated in daily routines, gathering plants, tending fires, preparing food, and crafting tools. Their lives were simple, shaped by the same demands faced by everyone around them. What set them apart was not status, but the quiet weight of memory they carried. They were custodians of meaning, operating as bridges between past and present, between the visible world and the intangible realm of interpretation that lay beneath it. As the centuries unfolded, these figures began shaping narrative structures that became increasingly complex. Some stories grew longer, encompassing multiple generations or entire migrations across unfamiliar landscapes. Others developed patterns that mirrored the movements of celestial bodies, connecting human experience to the grand arc of the sky. Over time, certain tales became associated with specific rituals, repeated at the same moment each year, to honor the forces believed to influence the world's cycles. These emerging traditions laid the foundations for mythologies that would someday flourish in distant civilizations. The keepers of story developed methods to teach their successors. During quiet moments, away from the larger gatherings, they spoke to younger members of the community who displayed attentiveness, curiosity, or an unusually strong sense of memory. They guided these individuals through the subtle art of storytelling, not instructing through formal lessons, but through shared experience. They demonstrated how to observe animals with care, how to note the shifting patterns of the sky, how to listen for the tone of the wind or the density of silence. They showed how to shape a story's rhythm, how to pause to allow meaning to settle, and how to weave details into narratives that carried both wisdom and wonder. This mentorship formed a lineage of knowledge that extended far into the future. Through the voices of these young learners, the traditions persisted across generations. Even as landscapes changed, as migrations carried communities into new territories, and as environments transformed under the influence of time, the essence of the stories remained. They adapted, yet their foundations endured, shaped by the wisdom of those who had watched the world with patient attention. Through all these traditions, the keepers of story influenced more than their own communities. Their tales guided migrations, shaped rituals, preserved ancestral memories, and provided meaning in times of uncertainty. They served as early cultural leaders, not through authority or dominance, but through the quiet strength of interpretation. Their legacy lived not in monuments or artifacts alone, but in the spoken patterns of language that carried forward long after their voices faded. As generations passed, the figures who carried stories forward became known not only for their knowledge, but for the steady presence they offered during moments of communal gathering. Their voices shaped the emotional texture of shared experience, helping communities navigate the delicate transitions between seasons, rituals, and the subtle changes in landscape that accompanied the passage of time. In many regions, they became quiet custodians of sacred places, locations where stones, earthworks, or simple clearings held significance greater than what could be seen on the surface. Some of these sacred places were situated near rivers, where the steady sound of flowing water created a natural rhythm that complemented the cadence of spoken narrative. Here, the keepers of story traced patterns in wet sand or arranged small stones to illustrate concepts that might otherwise remain abstract. They showed how river currents mirrored the flow of life, carrying memories downstream while depositing new stories along their banks. The community gathered along these riverbeds during seasonal rites, listening as stories connected the movement of water to the shape of human experience. Elsewhere, sacred spaces were found atop hills or low ridges, where wind moved freely across open ground. In these elevated places, the keepers of story spoke of ancestors who once stood in similar positions, watching storms form on distant horizons or observing the migration of birds across wide skies. The height offered perspective, both literal and symbolic, allowing stories to expand beyond the immediate details of daily life. From these vantage points, the storytellers described the vastness around them, the changing colors of dawn and dusk, the shifting lines of distant forests, and the patterns that emerged from long observation of the land. In some communities, ritual posts or carved markers were erected at these sites. Each post bore symbols meaningful only to those who had inherited the stories associated with them. Some markings represented animals believed to guide or protect the group. Others reflected celestial patterns, aligning with particular stars or phases of the moon. The keepers of story maintained these posts with quiet devotion, repainting them with pigments gathered from natural sources, replacing them when time or weather wore them away. These markers served as focal points during storytelling ceremonies, anchoring the tales in physical space and reinforcing the connection between land and narrative. Ceremonies themselves unfolded with gentle precision. The community gathered in a broad circle, forming a shape that echoed the earliest gatherings around the fire. Children sat closest to the center, their wide eyes watching the storyteller's movements with attentive curiosity. Adults formed the outer ring, listening with the familiarity of those who had heard the stories many times before. The stories often began with the same simple phrases that signaled the beginning of a ritual moment. The familiar rhythms created a sense of continuity, reminding listeners of countless previous gatherings shaped by the same patterns. The stories themselves carried layers of meaning. At the surface, they described the actions of animals, the patterns of weather, or the deeds of ancestors. Beneath these layers, they conveyed more subtle messages. lessons about cooperation, respect for the land, the importance of patience, and the need for balance between action and rest. The keepers of story understood that the meaning of a tale could not be explained directly. It needed to be felt through repetition and reflection. For this reason, stories were told in long, unhurried rhythms, allowing the symbolic threads to settle gently into the minds of listeners. As the community grew more accustomed to these rituals, the keepers of story began integrating additional elements into their narratives. They employed gestures shaped by tradition, open hands to represent the sky, fingers tracing arcs to illustrate migration, palms pressed together to symbolize unity. In some gatherings, they used small objects such as carved stones or woven baskets to represent characters or events. These visual aids offered tangible support to the stories, making abstract concepts accessible even to the youngest listeners. Over time, these gestures and objects became essential components of the ritual, preserved across generations like the stories themselves. While the keepers of story maintained their quiet authority during rituals, their influence extended beyond ceremonial roles. During times of dispute within the community, they served as mediators, drawing upon their deep knowledge of tradition to remind individuals of shared values. Their stories referenced past conflicts resolved through cooperation or understanding, offering models for behavior that upheld communal harmony. Though they held no official power, their presence encouraged calm, guiding the community through transitions and moments of tension. These figures also acted as educators, though their lessons did not take the form of structured instruction. Instead, they taught through example. When walking through forests, they pointed out signs of animal movement or changes in plant growth. Along riverbanks, they showed how water carved its way through soil and stone, demonstrating the power of persistence. In open fields, they taught the significance of birdsong or the meaning of cloud formations. These quiet lessons enriched the stories shared during rituals, grounding them in real-world observations and ensuring that the narratives remained connected to the land. In many regions, the keepers of story formed small councils, informal groups of individuals who shared responsibility for preserving and interpreting communal knowledge. These councils met during key times of the year, such as the solstices or the arrival of migratory herds. They exchanged stories from different regions, comparing variations and discussing their significance. Through these exchanges, myths began to blend across neighboring communities, enriching narrative traditions with new perspectives. The councils also prepared younger storytellers for future roles, offering guidance through shared discussions rather than direct instruction. As the centuries passed and early societies gradually expanded, the role of the keepers of story evolved. Some communities began shaping their rituals around more elaborate symbolic systems, integrating carved masks, decorated garments, and ceremonial dances into their storytelling traditions. In these societies, the keepers of story became ritual specialists, guiding complex ceremonies that required coordinated movement, precise timing, and deep understanding of mythic structure. The stories they told grew longer and more layered, blending the history of the community with cosmological interpretations of the world. Yet in other communities, the role remained simple, defined by the quiet presence of an individual sitting near the fire, shaping stories from memory and observation. Whether elaborate or understated, the essence of the role remained constant: to preserve continuity, guide interpretation, and maintain the thread connecting past with present. In archaeological terms, traces of these early roles appeared in objects associated with ritual specialists: ornaments made from rare materials, symbols carved with care, and tools used for creating pigments or sound. These items suggested a level of respect afforded to those who held the role, though not one rooted in hierarchy. Instead, the respect grew from the recognition that these individuals carried the stories that shaped identity. The artifacts they left behind revealed a life devoted to meaning rather than material possession, a life oriented toward the intangible force of narrative. By the time early civilizations began forming in distant parts of the world, on the banks of great rivers, along fertile valleys, and near coastlines shaped by tides, the foundations of myth were already deeply established. The keepers of story had shaped thousands of narratives that explained creation, guided rituals, honored ancestors, and offered structure to the mysteries of the world. Their work formed the groundwork upon which later mythologies would rise. Mythologies that would eventually be written, celebrated, and preserved through vast cultural traditions. In these early eras, before writing captured stories in permanent lines, the keepers of story remained vital. Their voices offered continuity through cycles of birth and death, through migrations across unfamiliar landscapes, and through the subtle shifts in natural patterns that shaped daily life. Their role endured because the human need for meaning endured, carried forward like a gentle flame protected from wind. The legacy of these early figures did not fade as cultures changed. Their influence extended into the structured priesthoods of ancient civilizations, into the poets who composed epics, into the chroniclers who preserved histories, and into the storytellers who sat in marketplaces or beside hearths during long winter nights. Their work lived on in every tradition shaped by narrative, in every culture that found solace in shared stories, and in every myth that carried earlier echoes of the ancient world. As the roles of the early keepers of story settled into the rhythms of their communities, their influence became woven into the deeper fabric of daily life. Their voices guided rituals, shaped ceremonies, and preserved memories that might otherwise have faded into the quiet movements of passing generations. Yet storytelling did not exist in isolation. Beyond the ritual spaces and communal gatherings, the wider world continued its slow and constant transformation. Rivers shifted their paths, herds migrated across open plains, climates warmed and cooled with the turning of unseen cycles, and human groups drifted into new territories shaped by opportunity and necessity. Through these long, gradual movements, stories traveled as steadily as people themselves. They crossed river valleys in the minds of migrating families, passed through mountain corridors carried by traders exchanging goods and memories, and drifted along coastlines where communities gathered near tidal rhythms. With each journey, stories adapted to new landscapes, absorbing elements from unfamiliar surroundings and transforming subtly with every retelling. What began as a single tale in one region evolved into countless variations across vast distances, shaped by climate, terrain, and the quiet influence of different peoples. Across these exchanges, storytelling expanded from a tool of memory and ritual into a force that connected distant groups. Narratives that once described only local landscapes began incorporating ideas from faraway places, new animals, unfamiliar weather patterns, and customs observed during brief encounters with travelers. Over time, this blending created networks of shared meaning that stretched farther than any single community's territory. And as trade paths grew more established and migrations continued, the stories themselves became part of what traveled, forming a subtle thread linking human groups across continents. It is into this wider landscape of movement, exchange, and long-distance connection that the narrative now turns, exploring how stories spread through early networks of travel and trade, shaped not by ambition or conquest, but by the quiet, steady flow of human curiosity. As early communities drifted across changing landscapes, stories traveled with them in quiet, unhurried rhythms. Human movement had always been shaped by necessity, by shifting herds, seasonal rains, or the search for richer soil. Each journey unfolded slowly, with long pauses for rest along riverbanks or beneath the shade of scattered trees. During these pauses, fires were kindled, meals were prepared, and the familiar cadence of spoken tales rose softly into the open air. The stories became companions to the journey, adding continuity to the uncertain paths that lay ahead. Along well-worn trails, the ground remembered the passage of many generations. Footprints layered lightly upon one another, created by families who moved between seasonal camps or ventured into new territories. With each movement, the stories evolved. A tale once tied to one river's bend found a new expression near another. A myth connected to a certain animal shifted its meaning when retold in regions where different species roamed. The land shaped narrative just as narrative shaped the perception of land. As trade slowly emerged along expanding routes, the movement of objects became intertwined with the movement of stories. Shells from distant coasts, polished by waves before being carried inland, passed from hand to hand not only as ornaments but as symbols of places few had seen. Their presence inspired tales of vast waters, powerful storms, and creatures living beyond the known horizon. In return, inland communities offered tools crafted from stone quarried in mountains far from the sea. Each exchange carried with it a fragment of identity, a reminder that distance did not sever the connection between people, but subtly expanded it. Travelers who moved between groups served as bridges of narrative. These wanderers remembered the stories of one region and retold them in another, blending local details with the familiar patterns they had carried with them. Around night fires in unfamiliar encampments, they described rituals witnessed far away, landscapes shaped by different winds, and traditions expressed by different rhythms. Their accounts stirred curiosity, inviting listeners to imagine worlds beyond their own valleys and plains. Many stories absorbed the influence of these travelers, gradually gaining elements from multiple regions until they no longer belonged to a single place, but reflected the vastness of human experience. In certain areas, natural corridors shaped by rivers or animal paths became conduits not only for travel, but for narrative connection. Along these routes, seasonal gatherings brought communities together in spaces where trade, ritual, and storytelling intersected. The sounds of flutes and rattles blended with murmured conversations, while fires illuminated circles of listeners who met only a few times each year. In these gatherings, stories expanded dramatically. Tales from colder climates mingled with those from warmer regions, creating a tapestry of ideas enriched by diversity. People returned to their home territories carrying not only new objects, but new myths that soon blended into local traditions. The landscapes themselves encouraged the growth of new narrative forms. In dense forests, where the canopy filtered sunlight into scattered beams, stories emerged that connected the play of light with unseen presences moving quietly overhead. In wide open plains where storms rolled in with slow, deliberate momentum, narratives arose that likened thunder to the footsteps of immense beings. Along coastlines where tides revealed and concealed stretches of sand, stories developed around rhythms of disappearance and return. Each environment offered its own language, a dialogue between the land and those who interpreted its signs through the lens of storytelling. As communities formed larger settlements with longer-lasting structures, storytelling expanded into new contexts. Open plazas and communal houses became spaces where stories were shared, not only during rituals, but during moments of rest throughout the day. Carved posts, decorated walls, and symbolic patterns woven into textiles reinforced the imagery of beloved tales, ensuring that narrative memory remained present even when voices fell silent. With each new structure and symbol, the stories gained physical anchors that allowed them to flourish across broader social networks. Yet even as storytelling adapted to these evolving settings, its essence remained tied to movement. Stories grew when groups ventured outward in search of new resources. They changed when families relocated after environmental shifts. They flourished during contact with strangers who carried unfamiliar knowledge. Across these interactions, narrative served as a kind of shared inheritance, flexible, portable, and capable of surviving even the most dramatic upheavals. This gentle expansion of storytelling networks mirrored the early movements of trade. Just as shells, pigments, and carved tools passed between regions, so too did the stories associated with them. A carved bone depicting an animal might inspire a myth in a region where that animal did not exist. A pigment made from a mineral found only in distant mountains might become associated with stories of great journeys. The connection between object and tale formed a subtle kind of economy, one not rooted in wealth or possession, but in meaning and shared imagination. Through all these shifts, storytelling remained a quiet constant. As people moved across river crossings or paused beneath ancient trees, as they waited out storms or prepared for hunting expeditions, stories filled the spaces between tasks. They offered comfort against uncertainty, guidance during transition, and companionship during long nights. They transformed unfamiliar landscapes into places of meaning, linking physical travel with the continuity of memory. By the time these early movements stretched across continents, stories had traveled farther than any single group could ever wander. They crossed mountains whose peaks shone with snow, deserts shaped by wind, forests thick with life, and coastlines shaped by tides. They adapted to new languages, new climates, and new customs, changing shape with each retelling, yet retaining the essential impulse that had guided their first creation, the desire to weave experience into meaning. As the routes of early travel became more established, patterns emerged in the way stories moved through them. Certain paths became known not only for the exchange of tools or rare materials, but for the sharing of narratives that carried symbolic importance. Over time, these paths resembled quiet arteries of culture, pulsing gently with ideas shaped by countless voices. A single tale might begin near a mountain range, where herds crossed narrow passes, then traveled downstream with migrating families, eventually reaching distant regions where the original landscape was unknown, yet the story found new relevance. With each retelling, details shifted softly, like sand reshaped by afternoon wind. A story describing a powerful animal spirit in one region might transform into a myth about a guardian of rivers in another. A tale rooted in forest shadows might take on new meaning along open plains. These shifts were not contradictions, but natural adaptations, expressions of how narrative lived within each community that embraced it. The stories remained alive because they were allowed to change, shaped by the environments and experiences of those who carried them. In regions where trade gatherings grew into seasonal traditions, the exchange of stories became as valued as the exchange of goods. Groups traveling from distant areas brought tales of lands marked by storms unlike any seen in local valleys, of animals that moved with unfamiliar patterns, of rituals performed in the presence of tall standing stones or vast open water. These accounts inspired curiosity and sometimes awe, inviting listeners to imagine places far beyond their own territories. In return, local communities offered their own stories, shaped by their histories, landscapes, and symbolic traditions. Through these gentle exchanges, networks of shared myth began to form. Networks held together not by political alliances or formal agreements, but by the quiet continuity of human imagination. As communities settled into larger and more permanent villages, the spaces where stories were shared took on additional structure. Some settlements developed central hearths designed not merely for cooking or warmth, but for communal gathering. Embers glowed low in these hearths during the afternoons, awaiting the larger flames that would rise after dusk. Around them, families arranged themselves in patterns shaped by custom. The keepers of story, though no longer the sole guardians of narrative, still held positions of subtle influence. They guided the retelling of older tales, ensuring that essential elements remained intact even as details shifted with each new generation. The emergence of early artistic traditions added new layers to storytelling, decorating pottery with lines and symbols, carving animals onto tools, and shaping figurines from clay or stone, all allowed stories to take physical form. These objects acted as companions to the spoken word, reinforcing themes that had become central to the community's identity. A vessel adorned with swirling patterns might reference the movement of water spirits. A carved animal figure might evoke tales of ancestral hunts. These items circulated through trade networks as well, carrying fragments of myth into distant regions and planting seeds for further retellings. Travelers who journeyed alone or in small groups served as carriers of more than physical goods. They often returned from distant regions with stories that broadened local understanding of the world. Their routes took them through forests where unfamiliar birds sang at dawn, across plains where storms built slowly on the horizon, and into mountain passes where the air grew thin and sharp. At each stop, they listened to local narratives, absorbing the cadence and imagery that shaped them. When they returned home, They carried these new stories like memories woven into their own experiences, sharing them beside evening fires in ways that linked distant landscapes to the familiar rhythms of daily life. In some regions, the movement of stories followed rivers more predictably than human paths. Families living along long waterways passed narratives from one settlement to another as easily as they passed boats laden with tools or food. Water carried sound across short distances, allowing gatherings on opposite banks to hear fragments of songs and stories drifting across the surface. These drifting echoes inspired retellings, enabling stories to travel even without deliberate intention. Over time, river valleys became repositories of rich narrative traditions, shaped by countless communities living along their winding courses. Mountain ranges created different patterns. Difficult to cross, yet rich in symbolic power, mountains gave rise to stories that reflected their imposing presence. Tales described great beings who shaped stone or controlled storms that formed near high peaks. Travelers returning from mountain passes brought stories shaped by the thin air, the sharp lines of ridges, and the feeling of isolation experienced at great heights. These stories often spread through communities far removed from the mountains themselves, carried by their deeper themes of endurance, mystery, and awe. Coastal regions developed another layer of storytelling shaped by the ocean's rhythms. The movement of tides, the appearance of distant islands on clear days, and the unpredictable arrival of storms inspired myths that connected human experience to the vastness of open water. These stories traveled inland through shells, driftwood, and dyed cloth traded across long distances. Objects that carried the scent of salt or the texture of sand stirred imaginations of inland listeners, shaping tales that interpreted the ocean even for those who had never seen it. Across all these landscapes, storytelling served as a map of shared understanding. It preserved knowledge of where to find water during dry seasons, which plants held healing properties, and which animal behaviors indicated changes in weather. Yet it also provided emotional guidance, helping communities navigate uncertainty by offering tales of resilience, cooperation, and cycles older than any living memory. As stories traveled, they connected communities through a subtle thread of shared meaning, weaving far-reaching networks of identity that crossed boundaries of land and language. By the time early societies developed into larger and more complex cultures, this network of shared narrative had already formed a foundation for the myths that would emerge. The early movement of stories through trade paths, river corridors, and migratory routes laid the groundwork for the later development of epic tales, sacred texts, and elaborate cosmologies. The ancient stories, shaped by countless retellings, became seeds of the narratives that would eventually be written into clay, stone, and parchment. Through it all, the central impulse remained unchanged: the desire to understand the world through meaning, to connect with others through shared memory, and to carry stories forward across time and distance. As early communities continued to move and evolve, these stories became lasting companions, always traveling, always changing, always returning in new forms to shape the cultures that emerged from their earliest roots. As stories drifted across valleys, river crossings, and unfamiliar horizons, they wove themselves into the quiet fabric of early human life. They traveled farther than any single group, adapting gently with each retelling, gathering new meanings as landscapes changed and communities evolved. By the time these stories reached distant corners of the ancient world, they had become more than simple recollections or practical guides. They carried echoes of countless voices, shaped by seasons of hardship and abundance, by rituals of continuity, and by the persistent desire to understand patterns in a world filled with wonder. Their journey spanned generations, moving steadily through the long arc of human experience. And in this enduring movement, they revealed a deeper purpose, one that lingered beneath every gathering, every ritual, and every night spent beside softly glowing embers. In this final quiet stretch of the story, the narrative turns toward the broader meaning behind this ancient impulse, exploring how storytelling shaped the inner world of early humans, how it helped define identity, and how its echoes continued far beyond those first circles of firelight. Across the vast sweep of time, the earliest stories softened into traditions that no longer belonged to any individual voice. They moved across generations like slow-moving rivers, carving channels through memory, shaping landscapes of thought, and carrying with them a sense of continuity that outlived the hands and voices that first gave them form. As centuries passed, stories became gentle anchors in a world that changed with each season, providing steady ground amid shifting patterns of weather, migration, and communal life. In many regions, storytelling became a way to remember origins, not in the literal sense of tracing lineage or recording precise events, but in the deeper sense of understanding how a community came to be. Tales of early ancestors wandered through half-light and imagination, their actions blending with natural forces and mysterious shapes of the landscape. These stories did not try to explain the world with strict clarity. Instead, they provided an emotional language that helped communities interpret the unknown. Through myth, early humans mapped meaning onto the vast uncertainties that surrounded them, creating a sense of belonging within the rhythms of the natural world. These stories also became a way to confront time itself. In a life without writing, memory shaped the boundary between presence and absence. When individuals passed away, the stories told about them softened the permanence of loss, transforming their existence into something that continued through narrative rather than disappearing into silence. Over generations, the actions of ancestors merged into broader tales, becoming symbols rather than literal accounts. The details blurred gently, but the emotional essence remained, allowing communities to carry forward the sense that past lives still echoed through present experience. In later eras, when societies grew more complex and communities formed larger settlements, storytelling adapted to new scales. It began shaping not only family identity, but cultural identity. Stories connected entire groups to landscapes, to the cycles of the cosmos, and to the invisible forces believed to move through the world. Myths emerged that mirrored local environments: river-born deities in lush floodplains, skyward spirits in high plateaus, and vast beings of sand and stone in arid regions. These tales offered comfort through familiarity, helping individuals see themselves as part of a larger continuity that stretched both backward and forward in time. Even as new tools emerged, as agriculture took root, and as early cities formed, the essence of storytelling remained rooted in the quiet gatherings of earlier generations. Fires still burned in central spaces, illuminating the faces of listeners whose minds drifted gently across landscapes shaped by narrative. Voices rose with a deliberate cadence, carrying patterns that listeners recognized instinctively. The stories, though now more intricate, still flowed with the same soft rhythm that once accompanied simple recollections of hunts, storms, and moments of wonder beneath the open sky. The meaning of storytelling expanded into the realm of moral guidance. Tales began to illustrate the consequences of actions, not through commands or rules, but through patterns of behavior embodied in symbolic figures. These stories helped communities navigate relationships, cooperation, and conflict. They offered examples of resilience during hardship, generosity in times of scarcity, and caution during moments of uncertainty. Though shaped by imagination, these lessons became foundational truths within the societies that embraced them. As centuries continued their slow procession, storytelling also served as a tool of preservation. It carried memories of landscapes that changed, animals that migrated or vanished, and ways of life that shifted with new technologies. Myths embedded fragments of the world as it once was, preserving the identities of plants, animals, and rituals long after they faded from daily life. Through narrative, the past remained gently present, adapted, reinterpreted, and sustained through the mind's ability to weave memory with imagination. At the quieter edges of these transitions, stories filled spaces that practical knowledge could not. They addressed the mysteries of birth and death, the unpredictability of storms, the long silences of winter, and the appearance of patterns that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. They provided explanations woven from emotion and observation, allowing early humans to find comfort in the notion that unseen forces shaped their world with intention. Even when later societies developed structured religions or intricate cosmologies, these early impulses remained visible, echoes of the first moments when humans gathered to shape meaning from darkness and firelight. The durability of storytelling lay in its adaptability. It survived famine, migration, and the collapse of early settlements. It persisted through the creation of new social structures, new technologies, and new forms of belief. Stories flowed effortlessly across language boundaries, carried by gestures, melodies, and shared imagery. They took root in new soil with each retelling, transforming yet remaining recognizable. This flexibility allowed storytelling to become one of the oldest and most enduring elements of human culture. In the long sweep of history, the first stories gave rise to elaborate mythologies, vast worlds populated by gods, spirits, heroes, and symbolic creatures. These mythologies shaped the foundations of early civilizations, guiding rituals, inspiring art, and forming the basis of early laws. They helped communities articulate their place in the cosmos, offering cosmological maps that connected the movements of the stars with the cycles of human life. Yet even in these grand structures, the earliest impulse remained, the desire to bring meaning to experience through narrative. As the world entered eras marked by writing, the oldest stories found new life on clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, carved stones, and illuminated manuscripts. But even as they became fixed in text, the oral traditions persisted, carried forward by voices in marketplaces, homes, temples, and fields. The written forms preserved the words, but the spoken forms preserved the rhythm, the soft pauses, the quiet breaths, the atmospheric cadence that connected storytelling to the slow rise and fall of natural life. In many places, the written and spoken traditions coexisted, each enriching the other while maintaining their distinct qualities. Through all these transformations, the essence of storytelling remained intertwined with the human condition. It allowed individuals to situate themselves within the flow of time, to understand their community's values, and to imagine possibilities beyond the immediate horizon. It offered comfort during moments of uncertainty, continuity during periods of change, and gentle reassurance across generations. The stories carried truths not bound to fact, but to emotional insight, truths that helped shape the way people perceived the world. In the modern world, where technology shapes communication and information, flows faster than firelight ever could, the ancient impulse has not disappeared. It lingers in quiet conversations, in traditions passed down among families, in the imaginative worlds created in books and films, and in the simple desire to share experiences through narrative. These contemporary forms remain connected to the earliest gatherings, linked by the same need to interpret life through meaning and memory. And so, the story of storytelling itself becomes a reflection on what it means to be human. From the first flickering fires near darkened forests to the expansive mythologies that shaped civilizations, narrative had been a constant companion, a source of connection, stability, wonder, and identity. Its beginnings were humble, formed from murmured observations and quiet gestures among small groups. Yet over time, these beginnings grew into a tapestry spanning thousands of generations, carrying within it the echoes of countless voices speaking softly into the night. Like the embers of an ancient fire slowly dimming beneath a blanket of ash, the origins of storytelling remain warm in the memory of humanity, an enduring presence that continues to glow in the stories told today. As the long arc of the story settles into stillness, the memory of those first fires remains gently aglow, flickering at the edges of thought like distant embers preserved across ages. The ancient voices that once shaped tales beneath open skies drift softly into silence, yet their presence lingers in the quiet spaces where imagination continues to breathe. Across countless generations, stories have carried humanity through darkness and dawn, guiding minds with their gentle rhythms and steady light. Now, as the final moments of this reflection fade, the echoes of those early storytellers rest peacefully once more, returning to the quiet from which they first emerged, leaving only a calm hush and the soft impression of a world shaped by timeless narrative.